A grieving warrior found an orphan in the wreckage and saw his own daughter's eyes. The scorched earth reeked of shock, raw grief, and a terrifying silence. Huddled in the splintered remains of the wagon, Grace's knuckles were white around her mother's silver locket. Every shadow was a monster. Every gust of wind was a whisper from the dead. She was just 16, a girl who knew needlepoint, not survival. But a flicker of grit deep in her soul refused to be extinguished. Her family had been bushwhacked, slaughtered by men who laughed as the flames rose. The image was burned into her mind, the face of their leader, a man with a jagged scar and eyes as dead as the desert floor. His voice echoed in her head, a cruel, mocking drawl. Suddenly, a new shadow fell over her, larger, darker than the others. It wasn't one of the killers returning. It was something else entirely. She was the last one alive. But in these lands, that doesn't mean you've survived. It just means you're next. The silence was wrong. It was the silence that followed a scream, the hollow space where a life used to be now filled with the lazy hum of insects growing drunk on what was left of her world. From her hiding place in the splintered belly of the family wagon, Grace could smell it all, the acrid perfume of gunpowder, the sick, sweet copper tang of blood, and the faint, heartbreaking scent of her mother's spilled rosewater. The world had ended at sunset. Now in the bruised twilight, only the flies were celebrating. She didn't move. Her body was a knot of terror, coiled so tight she thought her bones might snap. Her knuckles were bone white, where she clutched the silver locket against her chest, its metal now cold, so terribly cold. Just yesterday, it had held the warmth of her mother's skin. Look at the stars. Gracie, her father's voice echoed in her memory, a ghost of a sound against the terrible quiet. They'll always guide you home. But there was no home anymore. Home was the splintered wood beneath her cheek and the crimson stains on the floorboards. Home was the memory of a harmonica playing a cheerful tune now silenced forever. A single tear escaped, hot and treacherous, tracing a clean path through the grime on her face. She choked it back, swallowing a sob that felt like swallowing glass. Sound was a betrayal. Sound was death. Then a new sound cut through the drone of the flies. Crunch, the sound of a heavy footstep on dry earth and gravel. It was slow, deliberate, not the frantic, chaotic steps of the attack. This was something else, something worse. This was a predator circling the dead. Grace held her breath, a tiny trapped thing in her throat. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, trying to merge with the wreckage to become another forgotten object in the carnage. The footsteps grew closer, each one a hammer blow against the anvil of her heart. A shadow fell over the ripped canvas opening of the wagon, blotting out the last of the dying light. It was immense, a form so large it seemed to consume the sky. This was a new kind of monster, one made of earth and shadow, and it had found her. Slowly, a large hand gripped the edge of the canvas. The knuckles were scarred, the skin weathered like ancient leather. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for an end that was swift. The canvas was torn away with a single powerful motion, flooding her hiding spot with the pale, merciless light of the moon. She forced her eyes open. He stood there, a giant carved from the stone and sorrow of the land itself. His face was a mask of hard plains and shadows unreadable. His eyes dark pools that reflected the moonlight without giving away a single thought. He was a native warrior, his broad chest bare, save for a simple bone necklace, his long black hair unmoving in the slight breeze. He looked at the carnage around him, his expression unchanging. Then his gaze fell upon her. He didn't seem surprised. He simply looked, and in that long, silent moment, Grace felt her entire life being weighed and measured. He saw her not as a girl, but as a thing, a survivor, an inconvenience, or perhaps a loose end. His eyes narrowed slightly, and she saw a flicker of something in their depths, not pity, but a distant ancient pain, a recognition. He stood there for an eternity, the silence stretching until it was a physical thing, a suffocating blanket. He could leave her. He could kill her. The land would swallow her whole, and no one would ever know. Instead, he spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder rolling across the plains. It was the first human voice she had heard since the screams. "Come." He said the single word, not a request, but a command forged in a lifetime of hardship. He extended a hand not to help, but to order. "If you want to live." She followed. That was all there was to it. Her world, once filled with the gentle rhythms of family and the promise of a new life, had been stripped down to that single brutal action. She placed one foot in front of the other, her gaze fixed on the broad leather-clad back of the silent warrior who had pulled her from her tomb. He did not have a name. He was a direction. He was survival. The sun rose a merciless eye in a bleached white sky, and with it came the heat. It was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on her, baking the grief into her bones. The land was a new enemy. Alkali flats stretched before them, a shimmering white hell where nothing grew. The man, her rescuer, her captor she did not know, moved across it with an unnerving economy of motion, his moccasins leaving faint prints in the cracked earth. Grace stumbled behind him, her city-made shoes already scuffed and worn, offering no protection from the sharp stones that littered their path. He did not look back. Not once. He only stopped for water, leading her not to the stagnant pools that shimmered like cruel jokes in the distance, but to a patch of scrubby green weeds. He dug at the roots with his bare hands and gestured for her to drink from the clean, cool water that seeped from the soil. "Drink," he commanded, his voice a dry rasp. She obeyed the water, a shock of life in her parched throat. He offered no comfort, no words of encouragement. When she slowed, he would stop and wait, his patience a more profound and terrifying condemnation than any angry shout. It was the patience of the mountain waiting for the stone to fall. It said, "Keep up or be left behind." The silence between them was vast, filled only by the whisper of the wind and the pounding of her own blood in her ears. By midday, her feet were bleeding. Every step was a fresh agony. She thought of her mother, of the soft quilt she had wrapped around her shoulders on cold nights. The memory was a knife twisting in her gut. She stumbled, a sob escaping her lips. He finally turned then. His dark eyes scanned her not with sympathy, but with a sharp, assessing gaze. He saw the torn shoes, the pale face, the trembling. He grunted a low sound of what might have been annoyance or resignation, then unslung a small pouch from his hip. From it, he produced a strip of dried meat so tough it was like chewing leather, and a small piece of hardened tallow. He motioned to her feet. With clumsy, fumbling fingers, she removed her shoes and rubbed the grease onto her raw, blistered skin. It did little for the pain, but it was the first hint of care he had shown, an act so small and impersonal it only made her feel more alone. They continued their march. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the sun, the pain, and the unmoving back of the man ahead. Then he stopped. He did not stop for her. He stopped because the land had told him something. He froze mid-stride, his entire body going utterly still, like a wolf sensing danger on the wind. Grace, startled by the sudden halt, bumped into his back. It was like running into a wall of solid rock. He knelt, his long fingers hovering just above the ground. Grace followed his gaze. There in the dust were tracks, hoof prints, shod horses, many of them. They were fresh, but it was the way they were made that made her blood run cold. They were not the wandering tracks of travelers or hunters. They were a straight, purposeful line cutting directly across the plains, the tracks of a wolf pack closing in. Makwa looked up from the tracks, his eyes meeting hers. He raised a single hand and drew a slow, deliberate line across his own throat. There was no need for words. "They are hunting us." The world shifted. The exhaustion, the pain in her feet, it all vanished, burned away by a new electric terror. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her into a run. They fled, no longer marching, but scrambling for their lives toward a jagged spine of rock that jutted from the prairie floor. The sound of distant horses, a faint drumming, reached them on the wind. He shoved her into a narrow crevice between two massive boulders just as three riders appeared on the horizon, dark silhouettes against the blinding sun. Grace recognized one of them, the man with the scar, the man whose laughter had echoed as he'd set their wagon ablaze. A scream built in her throat, hot and sharp, but Makwa's hand clamped over her mouth, his other arm a steel band around her, holding her still. They watched breathless as the riders passed, their voices carrying on the wind, cruel and careless. They had not been seen. When they were gone, he released her. The adrenaline fled her body, leaving a void. The strength that had carried her born of fear and shock gave out completely. The world began to tilt and swim, the edges of the rocks blurring into soft, dark shapes. The sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. Her last thought was that she had survived the monsters only to be consumed by the land itself. Then the darkness took her, and she collapsed in a heap at his feet. Darkness and fire. Her world was a fever dream, a suffocating blanket of heat and thirst. She was running, always running, but her feet were made of lead. The man with the scar was behind her, his laughter a rattling sound like stones in a dry gourd. Then another shape would loom, immense and dark, a mountain that blocked the sun. It would force a bitter, earthy liquid past her lips, the taste of crushed leaves and river mud, and the fire in her veins would cool for a moment before the darkness swallowed her again. Papa, it's so cold. The world returned slowly, sharpening from a soft blur into the hard edges of rock and flickering light. The first thing she felt was the coolness of damp stone against her back. The first thing she smelled was wood smoke and roasting meat. The first thing she saw was the roof of a cave, its ceiling painted with dancing monsters cast by a small contained fire. She was alive. She pushed herself up on trembling elbows. She was weak, her body a hollow aching thing, but the fever was gone. Across the fire, he sat. Makwa. He was watching her, his dark eyes unblinking in the firelight. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was tending to a small piece of rabbit meat sizzling on a sharpened stick. He had carried her here. He had built the fire. He had nursed her through the fever. The realization settled not with a crash, but with a quiet, profound stillness. He had saved her. Again. You? She began, her voice a raw, unused croak. You stayed. He did not reply. He simply took the cooked meat, tore off a small tender piece, and offered it to her on the end of the stick. She ate the simple act of chewing an exhausting effort. They sat in a silence that was different now. The fear was still there, a coiled snake in the pit of her stomach, but it was joined by a new bewildering emotion. Gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. The words felt small, hopelessly inadequate. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, his gaze fixed on the flames. Hours seemed to pass. He was a master of silence, while for her it had always been something to be filled with chatter, with music, with life. Now it was just a space that amplified the ghosts of her family. To fight them back, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. What is that? She asked, nodding toward the single polished bone tooth that hung from a leather thong around his neck. He looked down at it, his large hand covering it for a second. The firelight carved deep shadows into his face, making him look older, sadder. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. It is a name, he said finally, his voice low. The bear that I fought when I was a boy, the one that gave me my strength. She looked at his hands, so large they could have snapped her in two, yet she had seen them gently grinding herbs for her fever. You are strong, she admitted. Another silence. This one was heavier. She felt she had overstepped, but she couldn't take the words back. She hugged her knees to her chest, feeling the familiar chill of loneliness creep back in. Do you have a family? The question left her lips before she could stop it. It was a desperate, foolish plea for connection. His face hardened. He stared into the fire as if watching a past only he could see, a world burning to embers. I had one, he said, each word a stone dropped into a deep well. A wife. A daughter. She was small. Her laugh was like the sound of bells in the spring. He paused. Grace held her breath, not daring to move. The people of the bluecoats came. He continued, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. They came with fire and long knives. They said our land was theirs. My wife was brave. My daughter. He stopped. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He did not need to finish. Grace understood. The chasm between them, of race, of culture, of fear, was suddenly gone, replaced by a fragile bridge built of a shared, unspeakable grief. He was not a savage. He was not a monster. He was a man, and his heart had been broken just like hers. Tears welled in her eyes, not for herself this time, but for him, for the wife he had lost, for the daughter whose laugh he would never hear again. I'm sorry, she whispered. He looked at her. then truly looked at her, and for the first time she saw past the warrior's mask. She saw the man. He gave another slow nod, an acknowledgement of a pain that needed no more words. The tension in the cave eased, replaced by a quiet, melancholic peace. Later, to break the somber mood, he wordlessly took a piece of charcoal from the fire. On the cave wall he began to draw. He drew the stars, the great bear and the hunter, showing her how his people navigated the night. She watched fascinated as he gave the sky back to her, a sky she had thought only held death. For a fleeting moment, huddled by the fire deep in the earth, she felt safe. That's when they heard it. A faint sound from the mouth of the canyon below. The scrape of a boot on rock. A low, guttural laugh carried on the wind. Grace's blood ran cold. Makwa was on his feet in an instant, his body a silent, lethal shadow. He peered out from the edge of the cave entrance, then pulled back his face, a mask of stone. The sanctuary had become a trap. They were here. The voices echoed from the canyon floor, ugly and sharp. They slithered into the sanctity of the cave like smoke. "Come on out, little girl. We ain't gonna hurt you much." It was Silas Kane's voice, a greasy, confident drawl that made Grace's skin crawl. Laughter followed, brutish and hollow. They were trapped. The word was a stone in her throat. Makwa moved without a sound, melting back from the cave entrance. He was no longer the quiet caretaker or the sad-eyed storyteller. He was something else now, something primal and terrifyingly focused. In the dim light, his face was an unreadable flint mask, his body coiled with a lethal stillness. He checked the edge of his knife with his thumb. He was preparing for a last stand. For death. Grace felt a familiar, paralyzing cold spread through her limbs. The instinct to hide, to curl up and disappear was overwhelming. She was just a girl. What could she do? The memory of her father's dead eyes flashed in her mind. The scent of gunpowder, the laughter. No, not again. A new feeling, hot and fierce, burned through the frost of her fear. It was rage, a desperate, hopeless rage. She would not simply wait to be slaughtered. She crawled to the edge of the cave mouth, peering down into the narrow pass below. 3 of Silas's men were cautiously advancing, their rifles ready. Silas and another man stayed back, confident. As her terrified gaze swept upwards, she saw it. Directly above the narrowest point of the pass was a steep slope of loose rock and scree, a whole section of the cliff face held in place by a few precariously balanced boulders. A scar on the mountain, a trap made by nature. An idea born of pure desperation screamed in her mind. Makwa. She hissed, her voice a raw, ragged thing she didn't recognize. He turned his head, his dark eyes questioning. She pointed a trembling finger not at the men but at the rocks high above them. "The rocks up there. They're loose." For a second he stared at her, and then his gaze followed hers. Understanding dawned on his face. It was not a smile but a flash of something fierce and predatory. He had been preparing for a warrior's death. She had just given him a hunter's chance. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice a low growl. He moved to a different part of the cave, finding a spot where the inner wall connected to the unstable outer ledge. He placed his hands and shoulder against a key section of rock and pushed. Nothing happened. The men below were getting closer. He pushed again, a guttural roar tearing from his throat, the sound of pure, focused power. The world seemed to groan. A deep grinding sound vibrated through the stone beneath Grace. The ledge shuddered. Below, one of the men looked up, his face a mask of confusion. Then the mountain fell. It was not a slide. It was an avalanche. A river of stone and dust thundered down into the canyon pass, a deafening roar that swallowed all other sound. The men below were consumed. One vanished completely. The others were thrown like dolls, their screams cut short by the crushing, grinding weight. Chaos erupted. Silas, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, fired his rifle wildly at the cave. Bullets ricocheted, sparking off the stone around Grace as she scrambled back. But Makwa was already gone, disappearing into the dust and confusion like a vengeful spirit. Grace could only see flashes of the battle below. A whirlwind of brown skin and dark hair, the glint of a knife, a strangled cry. One of Silas's men stumbled out of the dust cloud, clutching his chest before falling face first into the dirt. Makwa was a ghost, using the rocks and the terrain as his weapons, striking and vanishing before they could draw a bead on him. It came down to two. Silas Kane, his face purple with rage, stood his ground near the canyon entrance. "Damn you, savage, fight me like a man," he roared. Makwa emerged from the rocks, moving with an unnerving calm. The final confrontation had arrived. It was not a gunfight. It was something older, more brutal. A collision of raw hatred and righteous fury. They crashed together, a desperate struggle of knife and fist. Silas was strong, but he fought with a wild, sloppy rage. Makwa fought with the deadly precision of a wounded bear, each movement economical, each blow designed to cripple. Grace watched her heart hammering against her ribs, unable to look away. This was it. The judgment. She saw Silas lunge, saw Makwa turn, saw the flash of Makwa's knife. Silas staggered back, his eyes wide with shocked disbelief. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt. Then his gaze met Grace's for a fleeting, horrifying second. He opened his mouth, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. Then he fell and was still. Silence. The roar of the rock slide was replaced by an echoing quiet. It was over. A wave of relief so profound it made her dizzy washed over Grace. He did it. Makwa had saved them. She looked for him. He was standing over Silas's body, his chest heaving. He slowly straightened up. He turned his head and looked up at her at the cave. His face was unreadable. Then his legs buckled. He folded in on himself, not with a cry, but with a quiet final surrender to gravity, and collapsed onto the blood-soaked floor of the canyon. The silence that returned to the canyon was heavier than the roar it replaced. It was a weighted, listening silence, thick with the ghosts of the last few minutes. For a heartbeat, Grace remained frozen in the cave mouth, a spectator to the carnage she had helped unleash. The world was a painting of dust and death. Then she saw him fall, and the painting shattered. Makwa. The name was torn from her, a raw, desperate sound that echoed off the stone walls. The fear that had paralyzed her moments before transformed, reforged in the fires of crisis into a singular, sharp-edged purpose. Get to him. She did not climb down. She scrambled, half falling down the treacherous slope of the rockslide she had created, the sharp stones tearing at her hands and dress. She ignored the pain. She landed hard on the canyon floor, the bodies of the fallen men nothing more than grotesque obstacles in her path. Her world had shrunk to the size of the warrior lying motionless in the dust. He was alive, barely. His breathing was shallow, his eyes closed. A dark, ugly wound wept blood high on his side, a deep gash where Silas's knife had found its mark. The dust was already beginning to cake into a grim reddish-brown paste around it. They couldn't stay here. This was a valley of graves. Her mind, once a storm of panic, was now terrifyingly clear. She saw what needed to be done with the cold logic of a survivor. She took the knife from his belt. It felt heavy and alien in her hand. She cut long strips of leather from the saddle of Silas's horse. She found a fallen branch, strong and straight. With trembling, determined fingers, she fashioned a crude travois, lashing the branch between two of the dead men's rifles. Getting him onto it was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was a dead weight, a mountain of a man. She pulled. The ground fought back. Every muscle in her back and arms screamed in protest. She pulled again, gritting her teeth, a low sob of pure effort escaping her lips. He slid onto the makeshift sled. Then began the exodus. She was the beast of burden, now leaning into the leather straps, dragging her savior away from the field of his victory. The journey was an eternity of sweat and dust and pain. She followed the canyon until it opened up, and there, shimmering in the afternoon light, was a thin line of green, a river. She dragged him to its edge, collapsing onto the cool, damp earth, her lungs burning. The water ran clear over smooth gray stones, whispering a song of life that seemed a world away from the canyon silence. This was their sanctuary. For the next day, she worked. The girl who knew needlepoint vanished, replaced by a woman she did not know. A woman who knew how to heal. She remembered everything he had taught her, every casual gesture, every grunted instruction. She found the broad-leafed plantain he had pointed out, chewing the leaves into a green pulpy poultice to draw the fire from his wound, just as he had done for her blistered feet. She tore a strip from the hem of her own dress, her last connection to her old life, and washed the gash with the cold, clean river water. He was a furnace, his skin burning with fever. As she worked, she talked to him, her voice a low, constant murmur against the sound of the river. "You showed me how to find water," she whispered, her hands surprisingly steady as she pressed the poultice against his skin. "Now you have to drink it." She lifted his heavy head, tipping a few precious drops into his mouth. "You can't die," she told the still stone-like face. "You hear me. You are not allowed to die. I just got my life back. I will not watch you lose yours." He drifted in a sea of fever, sometimes murmuring words in his own tongue, words that sounded like the names of stars or of sorrows. She stayed by his side, changing the dressing, forcing water past his lips, her vigil relentless. She did not sleep. She watched him, and she watched the horizon. On the second morning, the fire broke. His skin was cool to the touch. He woke near dusk. His eyes opened, not clouded with fever, but clear and deep. He looked at the clean bandage on his side. He looked at the small pile of edible roots she had gathered. He looked at her face smudged with dirt and exhaustion, but resolute. "Water," he rasped. Grace's heart leaped. "I'm here," she said, her voice thick. She lifted the water skin to his lips. "I have it. Just rest." He drank, then lay back, his gaze never leaving her face. He saw her, not the frightened, helpless child from the wagon, but the fierce woman who had dragged him from his own grave. The corner of his mouth twitched, the faintest hint of something that was almost a smile. Strong, he whispered the word, a breath of air, like the bear. They sat in the fading light, the river whispering its secrets beside them. The crisis was over. The hunters were gone. They had survived. They looked at each other. The warrior and the orphan, two survivors bound by blood and grief. And in the vast, quiet wilderness, a new silence descended, filled not with terror, but with a single unspoken question that was bigger than any enemy they had faced. What now? The days by the river unfolded in a rhythm of quiet healing. The violent echoes of the canyon faded, replaced by the steady whisper of water over stone and the rustle of cottonwood leaves in the breeze. A new language formed between them, one spoken not with words, but with shared tasks and knowing glances. Grace learned the weight of his silence, how it could mean contentment as he carved a piece of wood or deep thought as he watched the stars appear. He learned the sound of her footsteps, how they had changed from the hesitant shuffle of a victim to the sure, quiet tread of a hunter. She would return to their small camp with a rabbit or a brace of sage grouse, and he would give a slow nod of approval, his eyes holding a warmth she had once thought impossible. He was still a mountain of a man, but he was no longer a figure of terror. He was simply Makwa. Her Makwa. The thought came to her unbidden one afternoon, as she watched him teach her to fletch an arrow, his large scarred hands guiding her smaller ones with surprising gentleness. He was the only family she had left. He was home. But the seasons were turning. A chill began to bite the morning air, and the high peaks to the north were dusted with the first powdered sugar snows of winter. The river, their sanctuary, would soon become a prison of ice. The unspoken question that had hovered between them grew heavier with each passing day. One evening, as the fire painted their faces in amber and gold, Grace finally gave it a voice. "There's a fort," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Fort Laramie. My father had a map. I think it's north of here. Maybe a week's ride if we can find horses." She looked at him, her expression pleading. "We could be safe there, Makwa. There would be walls, a doctor for your side, real food." She was offering him the only future she knew, a return to her world, to the civilization that had until now represented safety in her mind. Makwa stared into the fire, his face unreadable. He did not answer for a long time. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the growing dark. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than she had ever heard it, heavy with the weight of a truth she had never had to consider. "Safe." He repeated the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. "For you, little bird, perhaps. Your skin is the right color. Your words are their words." He turned his gaze from the fire to her, and his eyes held a profound, ancient sorrow. "For me, a fort is a cage with taller walls. They will not see the man who saved you. They will see a savage who captured you. They will not see a warrior. They will see a threat. He touched the healed, puckered scar on his side. Their doctors will heal this wound, yes, but they will give my spirit a new one, a deeper one. They will put their God in my mouth and their chains on my spirit. They will try to make me forget the name of the bear, the songs of the river. They will try to make me small. He looked away toward the vast, dark wilderness. I would rather die out here under the open sky than live small in one of their boxes. His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had been so focused on their survival, she had never truly considered the nature of his. Safety for her was imprisonment for him. The realization shamed her. The world she wanted to run back to was the very one that had destroyed his. Then what do we do? She whispered the question, now holding the terrifying weight of their shared future. We can't stay here forever. Winter will kill us. No, he agreed softly. He picked up a smooth, flat stone and began to draw in the dirt with its edge. We cannot stay. We must go north, but not to your fort. He sketched a line of jagged mountains, then a valley nestled within them. My grandfather, when I was a boy, told me of a place. The old stories tell of it. Unpauhi, the sun in the mountain, a valley hidden from the world where the winter is kind and the soil is black and rich, where the rivers run with fish and the herds of buffalo still remember the old ways. He looked up at her, a flicker of something she had never seen before in his eyes. It was not memory. It was not sorrow. It was a fragile, guarded hope. The stories say it is where the people go when the world becomes too loud, he said. A place to begin again. Is it real? Grace asked, her heart pounding. I do not know, he admitted, his honesty absolute. It is a story, a hope. But it is a direction away from the world of men like Silas Kane and away from the world of forts that build cages. He looked at her, his gaze intense, leaving the final choice to her. It will be a hard journey. We will be alone. Grace looked at the drawing in the dirt, a map to a myth. She looked at the world she knew, a world of wagons and towns and laws that had failed her, a world that had taken everything from her. And she looked at the man before her, the man who had lost just as much yet, who still held on to a story, a hope for a new beginning. The girl who had cowered in a burned-out wagon would have chosen the fort. She would have chosen the familiar walls, the false promise of safety. But that girl was gone. Grace reached out and placed her hand over his drawing in the dirt, a silent, solemn vow. Then teach me the way, she said, her voice clear and strong. Teach me the stories of the sun in the mountain. Their journey north began the next day. They were a tribe of two. They scavenged what they could from the outlaws' camp: rifles, ammunition, a sturdy horse. They traveled not with fear, but with purpose. The land changed. The desolate, angry red of the Badlands gave way to rolling golden plains, and then to the deep green of pine forests that climbed toward the snow-dusted peaks on the horizon. Makwa taught her the names of the trees, the calls of the birds, the secrets of the plants. Grace taught him to laugh again, a low, rumbling sound that startled them both the first time it happened. She would tell him stories from the books her mother used to read, tales of kings and faraway seas, and he would listen, his head tilted with a quiet, childlike wonder. They were no longer white and native. They were simply Grace and Makwa. They were partners. They were family. Weeks turned into a month, then two. They survived the first snows, huddled together for warmth in shelters Makwa built with an expert's hand. They grew stronger, their bond forged into something unbreakable by the shared hardship and the quiet joy of their new life. One morning, after a long and arduous climb, they reached a high ridge. The world opened up before them. Below, nestled between three towering snow-capped peaks, lay a valley. It was a perfect bowl of impossible green, even with winter's touch upon it. A river shining like a ribbon of silver snaked through its center. From this height they could see no sign of men, no roads, no forts. Only the land pristine and waiting. They did not know if it was the sun in the mountain of his stories. It did not matter. The sun broke over the eastern peak, flooding the valley with a brilliant golden light. It was the dawn of a new day on a new land. Makwa stood tall, his hand resting on Grace's shoulder. He was no longer looking back at the ghosts of his past. He was looking forward. Grace leaned into his strength, her face turned to the warmth of the rising sun. She was no longer running. She was home. They stood there for a long time, two solitary figures against the vast empty canvas of the west, their shadows merging into one on the ground behind them. They had lost everything, but in doing so, they had found the entire world.